What were you passionate about in your early, high school and college days?
We didn't have a lot of money when I was a kid, so we had to use our imagination to build the things we wanted to do.
How did you end up at SpaceX?
I got this random call from this guy who I thought his name was Elon Musk.
So what happened the day after you left? What was your plan? What were you going to build next?
So what I did was started a company where I could split myself out, fractional builder, if you will.
Hey everyone, and welcome to BitBuilders, where we sit down with the greatest minds building and exploring robotics in construction and space. Before we get started though, if you're a startup founder or operator responsible for innovation in your company, or you want a deeper, more insightful look into technology in AEC, you won't want to miss our newsletter. From deep dives into particular technologies such as AI, robotics, design, software, and so on. Hot takes from investors betting big in AEC technology, and advice on building tech companies, including the stories and takeaways of the most successful AEC technology founders. Head over to www.bricks-bytes.com and sign up today to get this exclusive material straight to your inbox. And now for the episode.
Hi, Jim. Thank you so much for taking the time to jump on BitBuilders.
My pleasure.
Do you want to introduce yourself? Because I honestly wouldn't know where to start. So just go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Yeah. So name is Jim Cantrell. I'm a space entrepreneur, auto enthusiast, and most of all, I think of myself as a builder. And I've been on 11 startups in space and some automotive, actually. And one of the most notable ones was SpaceX, which I was the guy that took Elon Musk to Russia back in 2001 to buy Russian rockets. And when that didn't work, we decided to build them ourselves. So it's been a long story of building cool and amazing things, which is my passion. It doesn't matter if it's a house, a business, a car, a rocket, or a satellite. I like building it. IKEA furniture does not count.
Which, by the way, sometimes it's so hard.
Yeah, right.
It's just difficult to line up all of them. Yeah. But thank you so much for being here for this intro. I have prepared, broad topics because I don't know what's going to come up in this conversation, just because of the broad scope of what you've done in your life. And so I really want to start with your early life, with your education. What was, were you passionate about in your early high school and college days before you started working on, really your working life. So, before that, where'd you go to school? Where are you from? Like, what was your upbringing like? I'm really curious to understand.
Yeah. So I grew up in a small town in California, and California wasn't always a megalopolis like it is today. And it was a chicken ranch, and we have lots of barns and lots of spare wood and things to do. And in fact, it was a hill that I grew up on. We had my grandparents lived on this hill with us, and it was a great place to build go-karts, these little wooden go-karts that I would steal the wheels off my dad's lawnmower and ride down the hill, right? So we're all about speed from day one. We didn't have a lot of money when I was a kid, so we had to use our imagination to build the things we wanted to do. And I guess that started a lifetime of that, right? And so I went eventually to college. I didn't want to go. I went to Utah State University, and how I ended up in Utah is a long, tortured story I won't bother you with, but it was kind of a foreign land to me. It was a religious minority and so on. It was a funny place, but I love Utah today very much. It's in my soul. But Utah State was a really good place to go to school. It was small back then. And I ended up in engineering. Why? I thought engineers like to build things. I was kind of wrong about that, actually. Engineers like to analyze things to build, right? So after I got 2 engineering degrees, I sort of faced this dilemma, if you will, of, I'm not really an engineer. I'm educated as one, and I know all about thermodynamics and mathematics. In fact, I have the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in math, but this isn't my tribe. So my first job I got out of college was working for the French Space Agency in Toulouse, France, and we were building a balloon for Mars, which was suitably strange. But what had led up to that was a internship at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where I invented some things, again, because of building skills for a Mars balloon. We were studying it in the U.S., and the French were doing it with the Soviets. And so I ended up being part of that whole mission. And that led me into this whole career with the Russians, and which led to Elon, which led to where I am today.
So I've read Liftoff. I'm looking for it in my library, but I can't see it. I read the book Liftoff that kind of like goes through the history of SpaceX, and this is like one of the most interesting bits of that story is that trip to Russia and what happened there. So leading up to that, how did you end up at SpaceX? I think a lot of people know the story of how Elon kind of like thought of the idea, started pitching some of his former friends at PayPal, and there's a lot of the business side, but the technical side and also the selection of the talent at the beginning is pretty obscure. And so I'd really love to hear it firsthand.
Yeah.
How did that happen? How did you end up at SpaceX?
Well, I dare say, Elon too was a builder, and he grew up in different circumstances than me in South Africa. But again, different age. He's a little bit younger than me, and he was focused more on digital building than I was. But he had this idea when he left PayPal to do something that would inspire humanity to want to settle Mars. I mean, and that, by the way, and you don't have to believe me, but it's true that the only thing he is about in SpaceX is about going to Mars. In fact, I would submit to you that his entire enterprise set is about settling Mars. He thinks that's the most important issue for humanity, period, to have a backup plan, as he calls it. So I was minding my own business in 2001. It was July of 2001. And I got this random call from this guy who I thought his name was Elon Musk. And that's what he said. I didn't know what PayPal was, right? I was working for a university-owned space lab at the time, and we were building a lot of things for the military, and mostly imagers and some satellite stuff. And I was Friday afternoon, I was driving home, and the phone rings, and I answered it, talked to him for a few minutes, and telling him, hey, I can't hear you. I had the top down on the car. It was a nice day, and it was, up there in Logan, Utah. It's beautiful in the summertime, and you always have the top down if you can. So he called me back about 20 minutes later. I tried calling him, and I got his, the number he called me on was his fax machine. And I made for those of you who don't remember, it makes a screeching, piercing noise. And I thought, okay, he told me he was a billionaire, blah, 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 PayPal. I didn't know any of this stuff. So I got a phone call from him about 20 minutes later, and he's upset. And so he explained to me, that was his cell phone, and he had he called from his fax machine, so people didn't bother him on his cell phone when they called back. So anyhow, long story short, he starts telling me about his whole desire to go to Mars and make humanitarian, multiplanetary. That was like, he's got this speech, my first goal in life is to make humanity multiplanetary. My second goal in life is to get humanity's addiction to fossil fuel ended. And the third plan for my life is to stop tyrants from controlling free speech. He thinks these are the three pillars of the survival of humanity, right? And so he said, I want to do this Mars mission, to address this, to inspire people to want to go to Mars. Would you help me? I need Russian rockets, and I'm told you're the guy that knows. And oddly enough, yes, I did know about Russian rockets, and I could call up the Russians and talk to them about this. So I said, sure, I'll help you. He wanted to come to my home. I wouldn't let him. In fact, I lied to him. He said, do you have an airport? And I said, yeah, I can see it from my front porch. And he says, great, I have a private aircraft. I'll fly in and I'll come to your house. And I'm thinking, no, you're not coming to my house. I have young kids, and I don't know who this guy is. He could be a lunatic, right? For all I knew. I mean, it's funny in retrospect, right? But that's how my thinking was. So I told him, I said, look, let's meet in Salt Lake City behind security. That was pre 9/11, so we could do that. And my theory was he couldn't pack a gun, or any other weapon easily, and there were police nearby. So this was kind of my standard MO for meeting people like this that I didn't know. And so we did. We met in a conference room there. And he brought in his friend Adeo Ressi. And turns out my friend Bob Zubrin was a part of this whole thing. So Bob had started the Mars Society. And when Elon left PayPal, he decided to go, put a $10,000 donation in the Mars Society donation jar at one of their meetings. And so that's how Bob led him to me. And, why was I, this guy knew about Russian rockets? Well, post-Mars, Soviet Union falling apart, I went back for about 6 years into Russia to help stop brain drain on behalf of the U.S. government. And we did joint missile defense work with the Russians. We hired a lot of their weapons scientists, their missile scientists, and we helped convert, in several cases, some of their ICBMs that were surplused out and laying around literally in warehouses to satellite launchers. So, the U.S. government helped start a lot of that, the Russian satellite launch business, which they subsequently have squandered, but which is another, there's ironies through all of this, right? And so when I met Elon, he wanted to do this mice to Mars mission. In other words, sending mice on a round trip to Mars to show that some sort of living creature could survive the round trip. And I had started to put together a team of people. I knew the Mars community, right? I knew the guys from the American Mars missions. And so I got, some calls in and I said, hey, would you, this guy's got some money. He wants to spend it on designing a private Mars mission. Everybody thought that was cool. So we put a team together, which ended up becoming the original SpaceX team, right? So they were all my buddies. And so we did the study for Elon, and then we figured out which Russian rockets would work. And then we went over to Russia. We made a series of trips over there. There were 3, as I recall. The last one with the intent of actually acquiring a couple of these launchers. And, just to put things in perspective, in 2001, when this happened, you could buy a Delta II launcher made by now Boeing for about $80 million. You could buy the equivalent in Russia for about $5 million. So you can see why he was attracted to this, despite all of the Russians have not been and are not very easy to deal with from a business point of view. They're very Byzantine. So, when we went over on the last trip, I don't know if they took him seriously or not. I don't think they did. I speak Russian. I didn't let on that I did. And I would listen to what they were saying. They called him Melchik, which is, boy, young boy in Russian. And, I could tell that they didn't really take this guy seriously. First group we visited, they spit on the chief designer spit on our shoes. He was kind of a strange dude, but we left there, and then we went to the second one. They treated us a little more Western-like because they were dealing with what's now ATK, or I guess it's Northrop Grumman, and they had some Western business relationships, so they're a little more sophisticated. But still, they didn't take him seriously. So on our way back from Russia, he announced to Mike Griffin and I, who was sitting by my side on the airplane, that we're going to build this rocket ourselves. And I have to put this in a perspective of history. So in 2001, to say we're going to build the rocket ourselves was a sheer act of insanity. You had Boeing, who dominated the launch business in the United States with these $80 million rockets, which were, by the way, very, very good rockets derived from the Thor Agena ICBMs from years ago. And, years and years and billions of dollars put into it. And here we are, a ragtag bunch of people with some guy with, $100 million, $200 million to his name. We're going to build a rocket ourselves. So it was, it was just insanity. And Mike Griffin, by the way, later became the NASA administrator and then Undersecretary of Defense under Trump. So he's no small player, right? And I'd known Mike a lot of years and drug him into this. So we said, okay, why not? It's going to be tough, but why not? And that's been really my attitude my whole life. Elon's the guy that really had the cojones, as they say here in southern Arizona, to do this, right? And we were happy to join along. I mean, honestly, we didn't have a lot to lose. Elon had a lot to lose, so he's the guy that took the real risk here. And so we got back to the U.S. and just like we designed a Mars lander, which had plant. That's eventually what we were doing for what we called Mars Oasis, this first mission. We put the same team together, so let's design a rocket. And it turns out, one of them, Chris Thompson, he was designing rockets and running rockets for McDonnell Douglas and worked on the Delta II. And then Tom Mueller, who became his propulsion guy, was building rocket engines for then TRW, now Northrop Grumman. And, a bunch of other people that knew about control software and things like that. So here we are doing this sort of thing. And we just had a little ragtag group, and we rented a small building in El Segundo, California, right near the LA airport there. And I can remember the first days, just couldn't get the network to work. I was the VP of business development, which meant I got to do everything nobody else wanted to do. And so I was running contracts and I did a little bit of engineering, but mostly, I did some architecting of the stuff. But I remember sitting there, email was very important to getting my job done. Couldn't get my email working. I'm looking out. Elon drove a McLaren at the time. And I'm looking out in the high bay where we're going to build rockets, right? And he refused to pay to have the floors painted, and there was insulation falling from the ceilings. This was not what you envisioned as the factory of the future. And I thought, really, we're gonna build rockets here? Those of us on the inside didn't think this would work. And I've talked to, despite what people will say today, I talked to people who were there. Some of my friends from the early days, and they shared my doubt, really. But they had no choice. They had burned the ships, as we say, and they had no way to go back home. And, so that's really the spirit of the early SpaceX. We had no choice but to make it work. And I bailed out early because I did have a ship in my back pocket. I could go. I had a lot of offers to do work for people. And I just couldn't see this working. My sentiment was not unusual among the early people there, but I had the option. So I left. And Elon and I had our differences, but that contributed to my desire to leave.
So,
hey listeners, I want to take a quick break to remind you about the Bricks and Bytes newsletter. If you're interested in learning about the technology shaping the future of construction, you won't want to miss the valuable insights we share each week. To get this exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox, head over to www.bricks-bytes.com and sign up today. Link is in the show notes. Back to the show.
First of all, that's incredible. I think to hear that firsthand for an aerospace nerd like me, first of all. But in general, I think that, what did that teach you? Because I can imagine what that would teach an engineer is you can do anything. If you can design, Falcon 1, make it fly, it's just incredibly powerful in the lifetime of an engineer. And if I look at what you've built in the future of that, that event, so in successive years of that event, I can kind of see that imprinting of SpaceX. We can do anything. So I'm really curious to see. So what happened the day after you left? What was your plan? What were you going to build next?
Well, so I had a lot of my friends from the industry who had a lot of admiration for what I'd done already, and they wanted to hire me. So what I did was started a company where I could split myself out, fractional builder, if you will. And what I was really good at was helping them find money, particularly government money. So I started a company called Aerospace. And basically, we started out in the consulting business, helping find new business. That evolved over time to have 50 people roughly. And we did all sorts of things, from pursuing opportunities, as we called it, with the U.S. government, to a lot of classified mission areas in space warfare, to eventually building satellites. So that whole enterprise culminated with a couple of projects. There was Cosmos One, which was the world's first solar sail, and we flew that on a Russian submarine. You can start to see a theme out of Murmansk, and we successfully built it. We successfully launched it, but the second launch blew up and destroyed the spacecraft with it. And then we followed that later with light sail, which we built 2 of those. This was with the Planetary Society, all private money. And then I got involved in building other spacecraft, and I'd say in that period of time, probably close to 45 spacecraft there that I worked on. Also worked on launch vehicles in that. And about 2010, 2011, I kind of went through a change in my life. And I just said, I think I'm done. I'm done with the government business. I'm done with the wars that were going on. I had been an early, I won't say a fan of the wars, but a supporter of, what we were doing in the Middle East. But by the time I started to see my children's friends come home with body parts missing, I said, I can't do this anymore. So I became a peacenik in a lot of ways. It's what you find a lot of soldiers, and I'm not a soldier, obviously, but you find a lot of them kind of come back from a war and they go, you know what, this is wrong. And so I walked away from the entire industry. I just said, I'm done. And, we had built a lot of really cool stuff. I'd done a lot of cool things, but I no longer found it honorable. And as I got older, honor was more important to me than how much money I had in my pocket. Of course, that was easy for me to say because I was making good money. But nonetheless, I started all over in my career. And one of the things that happened was the startups started happening. So Skybox Imaging was really the first one that I got involved with. When I left and shut down StratSpace, I started an automotive startup to build race cars and run them and run a race team. And that didn't make money. I mean, barely broke even. But the startups, were willing to grab me because of my prior exposure at SpaceX and the lessons I learned there. And so I helped Skybox grow. They were an imaging company that was the guys that came out of the intelligence community that built spy satellites. And in that world, spy satellites were $1 billion a piece, classically. It's the same problem as SpaceX, right? And these guys said, let's build them for $1 million a piece. What do you think? And I said, maybe. So I think we can get it to 3 or 4, right? Maybe not $1 million, but let's give it a try, right? It was kind of like SpaceX, let's build our own launch vehicle. Okay, maybe. Let's give it a try. And I was always willing to try these things where a lot of people weren't willing to sort of jump off the cliff or burn their boat. So we got Skybox working. We eventually built them for about $5 million a piece. We sold that to Google for $500 million. And that was like SpaceX and Skybox really made the space industry safe for investing, because you want to talk about, plowing new ground, going out and finding venture capital for space businesses was unheard of. And so Elon used his own money in the early days. Skybox, we went and found money, and we dealt with some of what I would now consider some less than savory venture capitalists, right? But we had a great exit. So we sold this to Google. Google eventually sold it to Planet. So what you see Planet Labs or Planet doing today partly was what we did in the early days. So I started a whole avalanche in my career of these startups coming to me. ICEYE out of Finland's one of them. I helped them very early on. York Space here in the U.S., they built satellite buses. I helped them get started, on and on and on. And so then I started my own companies after, I started to learn. And it, to your point about what you learn from SpaceX. So the first thing I learned from SpaceX is you can't dream big enough. And if you have a dream and you're dedicated to it, you can make it work. And, there's insanity and then there's insanity, right? So you have to have some realism to the dream. But the basic lesson is, don't talk yourself out of things. And then the second thing is that just as important to good engineering and being able to build something is your ability to have a vision, articulate it, and raise money. And that these two things are separate but very, very necessary ingredients in a successful startup. And every startup, I will tell you, is a shit show. It's a shit show at various levels. every investor is looking for a startup which has, no problems, a great management team, all the money they need, and they might just let you in because of some strange circumstance, right? That's like I'll call it the investor wet dream, if you will. And the reality is none of these companies are this. SpaceX at one point was down to $30,000 in cash in the bank, right? All these big companies end up with this as part of their DNA. And this creates a set of lessons for you if you live through it and you survive it. Even if you don't survive it, you remember forever, right? So the big lessons I have from being a startup and building hardware. So I can't really speak to software because I've never done it, right? All the startups I've been involved with was hardware. Moonlander, I was part of MoonX, satellites, rockets, all this really hard stuff. First thing is money. Be cheap, be scrappy. You have to put off all expenses until the very last day of the very last month that you think you have to spend that. And then you wait a month, because a lot of times engineers will think of other ways to do something and they don't need to spend that money. And if you look at the last year and a half in the market, it's been brutal. The investor, equity raising market has been brutal. I was just talking to a family office this morning that's an investor in us, and they said, for them, they've had to write off so many investments in the last year and a half because these companies are going under for mostly the reason of not being able to raise capital, right? So the only way you survive that is to be cheap, right? And in my company, Phantom, we've survived it because we're really, really cheap. And we've seen, even the likes of Richard Branson go away on bankruptcy because they spent too much money. And no offense, Richard, but you spent too much money, right? And these things happen. And so it's, it's like the laws of physics. You can't break them. And one of the laws of startups is cheapness. And the other one is, and I talk about this as related to racing cars, is you never, ever give up. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a car race, and I like to do these long endurance races with a team of drivers. And you get about 12 hours into a 24 race and you think, this broke and that, and you're trying to fix this. You think there's no way we can even finish this. There's just no way. And so if you listen to your fears, you stop and you go have a beer and say it's over. But if you listen to your vision, your desires, your goals, you get back in the race, right? You get back in the fight. And you just don't know how these things turn out. You just don't. So, every day you wake up as an entrepreneur, and if you feel like a warrior, you're going to win. If you feel like quitting, you better go back to bed and come back when you feel a couple hours later like a warrior again, because that's what it takes. So, it's been an interesting career. I sometimes wonder if I've lost my mind and I should have done something else. But in the end, I'm true to my own DNA in the sense that I just like to build things, and a startup is sort of the ultimate building of something. I built homes. I built a house in Utah. That was a great experience once. I will never do it again. I'm proud of what it. I looked at it the other day, and it's worth millions more than I paid to build it. Somebody else has it now, and that's great. But that's that inherent satisfaction. But a startup has got so many dimensions to it that it is really impossible to master it all. And that I have to credit Elon with giving me the bug on startups, right? I would have never in my mind ever conceived of this. So for me mentally, it became, you can do this, right? I couldn't imagine when I was at SpaceX, and one of the reasons I left is, how is he going to raise this kind of money? I watched Iridium. I watched, a lot of other, now Starlink competitors go under because they couldn't raise the money and they raised debt. And then when they couldn't make their debt payments, they got foreclosed on. I just thought, Elon, you got to raise $1 billion. I don't see how you're going to do it. And he did it, right? He did it by hook or crook.
It takes incredible strength, but it takes just an incredible set of skills to make it all, tie up together. I think the history of SpaceX, in the space industry, now there's this term that, that your company will be categorized under in a bunch of LinkedIn, market maps you'll find. It's called new space, right? So new space is basically for the listeners that are more construction and traditional industries oriented, less aerospace, new space is that segment of space companies that are post SpaceX, basically. If I have to give it a very cheap definition, and to become that year zero that SpaceX has been, I think all the money that Elon put in at the beginning was absolutely instrumental. Without that, I don't think you'd have all the iteration space
Wouldn't
that
happen.
had.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can confirm that, being, the beneficiary of that in the first place. And then what truly changed the fate of that was that NASA truly saw value in what Elon was building, what the team at SpaceX was building. And so a combination of factors that are like, government stepping in and helping out, private capital being hyper abundant after an insane exit, and just maniacs at the driver wheel, right? Like that's a really, really complicated combo to make work. And I love it because it just starts a new era of aerospace. And today I think it's fine. I had different plans, but that's okay, focusing on aerospace, because when I think about building and BitBuilders, which is kind of like the team of the podcast, it's like we want to have people that are building new technology. There's very few fields like aerospace. If you want to make stuff go through the Kármán line, which is, for the audience, the line that separates, what we call the atmosphere from the Earth, from outer space, you just gotta make it. Just gotta make insane stunts and feats.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm super curious. After all that we've said, you have founded recently. I don't want to say just because it's not true, but recently, given your career, you founded Phantom Space, and a few people like you have a view on what is needed in the industry, right? And you have also worked at SpaceX, so you know what the launcher market is like, and Phantom fabricates launchers. What is your thesis behind the company, if you have to pitch it to the audience?
Yeah, so I focus on fundamentals. I think one of the problems with new space, as you describe it, is that they don't know how to make money. If you look at the reason Starlink, as an example, is successful, is they didn't focus on innovation as a way to make money. They focused on just getting it done. And I look at the space industry as being not really in need of new technology, but in need of new ways of thinking about how to operate profitable companies. And if you look at SpaceX as an example, I mean, they're really, sort of my aspirational goal for Phantom. That they have a goal of going to Mars, which we don't have. We have a goal of making money in low Earth orbit. So we're quite different in that, but you have to have the same comprehensive strategy. I think today there's room for all sorts, right? But I think what's really massively missing, what we're trying to do at Phantom, is to create that ecosystem that will make space more accessible for a lot more people. Because let's face it, we need the brain power of humanity in space to create the values that come from, on my cell phone, I've got apps there. It's created an immense value on top of this core backbone. To do something like that in space, we have to attract in people, the BitBuilders of the world. They will piggyback on what we're doing. So really, we're at the stage in space today, I believe, where we were 500 years ago with the New World. Of course, we knew how to go back and forth, but we really didn't know how we were going to create value there. So it's intrinsically obvious to us now how much value was created here. But 500 years ago, you're kind of like Elon saying, hey, we're going to build a rocket where nobody else has done it. That's what Columbus did. So we're going to follow on behind SpaceX and create this low Earth orbit ecosystem where you have rapid launch that can get your stuff to space quickly. And it's like an airline. You pick a schedule and you go. We build the satellites for the customers who launch on our rockets. And then you end up also putting together a constellation. And this is where we think our real value is. We call it Phantom Cloud, which is basically data servers for satellites in space. And we start to move that data network off of the Earth's surface into space. so the satellites can communicate to our network. We put storage and compute on the satellites, edge computing, if you will, and that people who are software builders don't have to build hardware and get it into space, which is very capital intensive, to create value off that data flow. And so that's our 3-part business strategy. We think that the launch vehicle is the core underpinning, the strategic underpinning of this. And I was just reading an article yesterday on why Starlink is suddenly successful, where you've got 5 bankrupt companies prior to that, including Iridium, that were not successful. And I was part of Iridium. And so I saw it from the inside. And one of the key factors is just the internal cost of launch. So if we launch things ourselves, we do it at our own internal cost. So therefore, we can scale Phantom Cloud very, very cost effectively. If we build the satellites, we do that at our own internal cost. Even some of the recent OneWeb, for example, they went to a European large company to build the satellites, and they made a deal with the French government and so on. But nonetheless, they outsourced that. They outsourced the launch. They ended up going bankrupt in the same market where Starlink is now proliferating. And Amazon's kind of got the same problem. They've got their Kuiper constellation. They still have to go buy launch, because you might say, well, Jeff Bezos has his Blue, but they can't sell that at internal cost to Amazon because Amazon's publicly traded. It's a legal barrier. So we think of ourselves as kind of like Apple of space. I'm an Apple guy, not because I always have been. I was a convert, years ago, but I've got an iPhone, I've got an Apple computer, I've got an iWatch, I've got an iPad, Apple TV. I got the whole thing, and it works together seamlessly. And that's really what we're trying to do. And we think we can make a lot of money and advance the state of things in space and make it easier for you to put a software payload in space.
Yep. And let me set the playing field for so let me unpack the context around what you said for the audience. And please be my mentor here and cut me off if there's something wrong. But I think I should get it. So what you were talking about is, driving value from presence in low Earth orbit. And by low Earth orbit, we define that area is around 400 kilometers. I think it's 200 to 600, something like
right.
that, which is the area, of the orbit of Earth, where you have clear visibility of Earth. You have not too bad of a latency to send a signal down to Earth. And you have really solved access, let's say. So it's been proven by not only SpaceX, but way earlier, that you can place satellites there with somewhat a cost-effectively CapEx of a launcher and fuel, and etc. So what you guys are doing at Phantom is you're building the full stack infrastructure from the vector that puts you into orbit to the satellites that are going to orbit the Earth, with a certain lifetime, that will be connected to each other. That's why you described as a constellation. And you'll be able to stream down data from those satellites of all sorts. It could be Earth observation, sensor data, multi-spectral camera data. And you allow access to that data as opposed to having, the builders and the software kind of like
right.
data analysts, et cetera, just go out and shoot their own satellites in orbit, which is super expensive. So you're going to take on the early CapEx and do that. And is your goal to do that instead of for connectivity, which is what Starlink is doing for, visual data and sensory data?
Yeah. So Starlink is focused on what I would call consumer broadband, moving bits from anywhere on the Earth to anywhere on the Earth in a generic sense. We're thinking of it more in terms of what's the data flow in space that originates in space, and how can we intercept that, create value out of it? So it's like your cell phone network. Once you set the network up and you have devices that can now host software that makes value out of that, put that in space. And that we're really, one way to think of it is telephones in space. And, we'll own the network and we'll own the compute, just like Apple owns the compute on this, and they only allow certain apps on their phone. Same concept, right? And so what's going on right now is when somebody wants to put a constellation up there, they have to create their own AT&T network or their own Verizon or their Vodafone network. It's really CapEx heavy, and which is one of the things that's killing this business. You go back to what I earlier said about, hey, we got to be able to raise money, and in space, it's huge amounts of CapEx, and SpaceX just sort of reverse into that a little bit. It took them $1 billion to develop Falcon 9 and the Dragon. NASA wrote a report that I recently read back in the day where they said that it would cost them $50 to $100 billion. And indeed, they spent that much trying to do the same thing. And now we see the result of one of their things stuck to the space station up there. So clearly there's a better way to do this. And clearly we have to in order for it to proliferate, we have to get the CapEx down so that more investors can participate, because the risk tolerance of the ones who write big checks is lower. So the innovation is not going to be there. And I think where the innovation in space needs to be is not in the rockets, not in the satellites, but in the applications. And that's what we've seen on terrestrial telephone networks, and we'll call it the mobility apps, right? They really innovate at the application level, and that's, I don't think, any different in space.
So the beautiful thing is we're going from standalone satellites that are sending down their signal to their own ground station, and then the operators looking at that data, to the possibility of computing and storing data in space. Because something that people don't necessarily appreciate if you're not in the industry, if you haven't been in the industry, is that basically the data that you create on that small box that you need to optimize the weight of. Because if you go on SpaceX website, you're actually going to pay more for a heavier launch. You really want to put them down.
Right.
And I challenge the audience to go look at the pricing and run a sensitivity analysis there. But what you want to do is keep it small. So if you can send that data really easily to a data center in space or whatever, to a network of compute and storage, then you can offload that capacity, which directly translates into up mass that you have to send into space. Mm-hmm. So you're driving great cost efficiencies for the satellite manufacturers, and then in the end, you're just lowering the cost of the output.
Exactly.
I love the thesis.
Yeah,
I love it.
Well, it's infrastructure time still in space. Everybody likes to think of the Starship Enterprise and so on. We're not there yet. We still are building out the networks and the basic infrastructure.
What do you think it's next? What's the next hard thing that will have to be built? Let's assume that we're moving on a few years ahead, and Phantom and others are driving the new infrastructure layer of space. What's next? What do we build?
Well, so there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is the amount of data that's going to be created in space is exploding. It's kind of like broadband terrestrially. I now stream on my television, whereas about 5 months ago, I got rid of my local broadband network that goes through fiber in the ground to Starlink, right? And I stream my data. Whereas, 2 years ago, I watched it off of a cable network, and the amount of data required really fills everything that's available. So as we expand our ability to get data back from space, we're just going to create more data. And in fact, this is the great promise of AI in space, because if you look at AI, the way I view it is not the way a lot of people do, which is Skynet, it's going to destroy us and evil airplanes will come after us. It's really, how do we manage large data sets? And I'm a user of AI for writing, and it's a great way to have something look at large data sets and give you nice summary sort of understanding of it. It's really a consequence of our modern world. And that same thing's happening in space. We see this happening terrestrially because our bit proliferation is enormous on the surface of the Earth. It's only beginning in space. And so as that happens, there's really two things I think that have to be the next big things there. One is, how do we place AI in space efficiently? And then the second is, how do we innovate to get more data back, right? So I think there's a telecom innovation that has to happen, plus an AI/compute innovation. That's why we're focused on Phantom Cloud, is we think it's part of that next massive innovation that has to happen. We want to get ahead of it, because think about it this way, data centers on the Earth, they take a lot of electricity. That electricity costs something to do it. Everybody talks about green energy. Well, guess what? Everything in space is green energy. Almost everything. There's a few nuclear powered things, but that's even green if you want to look at it. But solar is cheap. So you need as much solar power as you can. Getting rid of that heat on the Earth costs you electricity. Up there, it doesn't. It just radiates off into space. No harm, no foul. So data centers, if you can, take away a lot of the factor of how do you get it up there inexpensively, and you're right about low cost, low mass, data centers in space make all the sense in the world. But then suddenly you end up with, how do you get that data ultimately back? Because we can pass the data around in space through optical links and basically lasers blinking at each other's satellites. And we get away from a lot of the radio interference things we have. And then we still have to go with a radio link down to the Earth. And so maybe there's optical communications things that happen there. So in terms of the low Earth orbit ecosystem, those are the two big things. When I sort of pull back from that and I go, well, what's outside of that? There's extraterrestrial resource utilization. And I think that's an enormous market, but it's years away, right? And at some point we'll see, and we already see the Chinese doing this a little bit. They're bringing back helium-3 from the moon on their landers, because helium-3 is source of clean fusion and
highly scarce.
Yeah, it's very highly scarce. I think the U.S. has 18 kilograms of it, and it's also used for very low temperature computing systems, and it's a strategic resource that is highly available on the moon. So we will see a time when extraterrestrial resources will become, a economically viable use on Earth, because we can get the cost to go up there, extract it, and bring it back down. And again, just like the New World, right? Going over used to take months, and now we get on an airplane, 500 years in the future. As that evolves, that'll happen. And then I think there's two others that I would put it into one category, actually: human settlement in space. And this is where SpaceX is going. You can say it's about Mars, but I'd say it's a broader category of human settlement in space. And Blue Origin's the same thing. If you really listen to what Jeff Bezos says, and I worked with him a little bit early on before anybody knew about, we used to call it Blue. It was kind of a code name. They were all about making space the industrial sector and Earth the residential sector, right? That's Jeff's vision. So it's about human habitation and operations in space. So those two things, I think, come together. And we're starting to see, in the United States at least, the space station's going to get deorbited. That was something that Ronald Reagan dreamt up. And when I was going to Russia in the 90s, they were building it with the Russians. So it's been up there a long time. And it ages out. And now they're talking about, awarding private space station contracts to companies. And so just like SpaceX broke the mold on crew transport and private launch, same thing's happening with astronauts. So, you've got all the attendant, tourism and all those sort of things, but human presence in space is sort of the ultimate thing that follows, right? And we all think of the Apollo missions as being something, that was and it was a very, very advanced thing for us to do in the 60s and early 70s. And I know some of the Apollo astronauts, talking to them about what they went through, land on the moon, it just scares me to death, right?
Can you imagine?
I can't. No, I can't. So Charlie Duke is a good friend of mine, and he was Apollo 16, and he talks about how they stood up because they didn't have the weight for seats on the lunar landing module, so they were standing as they landed on the moon, and just of course the weight's almost nothing. It's lunar gravity, but they had to sleep on hammocks, just strung them between different pieces of the spacecraft, and it's amazing what these guys did.
it makes no sense to just think about like, land and you're 16% your normal weight and you're just floating around almost. You can jump a few meters high. That's the wonder of space. Like if I have to go back and say, why am I so passionate? Maybe it was actually, I can trace it back to you. The reason why I'm passionate about space is that I think it was in 2014 or in 2013. I don't remember exactly, but I remember I'm 25 years old. So I remember seeing the first rocket, the first booster from SpaceX landing.
Oh yeah.
I think that it was a drone ship, the first one that they did. And I was like, what? You can work it just like it's a UPS, just going back to the warehouse, right? That's what it is. That's what you have to do, right? You have to make it a natural extension. You have to make space a natural extension of the Earth. And I love the vision that Jeff Bezos has. You make the industrial base out there and you make the residential spaces just down here. I was lucky enough to work for a company that's doing in-space welding, which is super important to build, large real estate. And they just launched their mission again on Falcon 9 to test that you can weld 2 plaques of metal with electron beam welding, which is very well known process. It works very well in vacuum, and it works. And apparently it works.
Good to hear. I didn't know that. Yeah, glad to hear.
It's awesome. The company is called Think Orbital out of Colorado. The CEO is actually Lee Rosen, former VP of government affairs of launch at SpaceX. So great advances are coming. We're coming up at the end of the hour. I promised you we were gonna end. We were gonna end in time for your next meeting. So I don't want to hold you further. But I want you to ask one thing. We have derailed completely the conversation on what's cool about space, and I just love it. I have zero regrets. A ton of founders hopefully are going to be listening to this because you're someone that they should be listening to, above all if they're building hardware. What would you tell them if they're in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, but why not in their 50s, and they're launching a new company and they're going to build super hard things? What's your advice?
Yeah, think about it as simple as you can. Try not to focus on widgetry. Maybe in some cases, widgetry, as I call it, is the focus of the business. Electron beam welding, I wouldn't call widgetry, but it's not core. But you got to make this. You got to make this really sort of at the lowest level of what do I need to get this done? Because hardware is expensive. It can turn into a science project. You got to try not to do that. And if you focus on what the product is and what people are willing to pay for, then you'll be successful, right? You'll keep your capital needs down. You'll make your product most easily sellable. And those are really, I think, the 2 major failure points of a startup that's building hardware, particularly for space. And bad product match, can't sell it, and then too much capital, can't raise it.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for this.
My pleasure, Gabriel.
Amazing hour.
Yeah, this is fun.
Let's hope that we can do a part 2 because we chat once once every few weeks, and so let's do it again.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to go so much deeper than we did. So
love to do it. It's a great conversation. Yeah, just let me know when you want to do it.
Awesome. Then thank you so much for being on.
Pleasure.
And I wish you the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, my friend.